Here is at the House Ways and Means Committee, and I'm glad Democrats are doing this because they, from a political standpoint, like I said the other day, it both has the practical effect of maybe forcing the government to actually move into some form of activity that is not suppressing what we know about this into actually like doing something about it. And it also sets the predicate, because Democrats do not do this well enough and have historic, and I believe it's a failure, just simply a partisan failure, to make it clear whose F up this is. And here is Lyle Doggett from Texas asking Alex Azar, who is the he is the Secretary of Labor, HHS, sorry, right. And this is in the wake of the HHS whistleblower saying, like, we sent a bunch of people down to deal with these people who have been, quarantined without the proper gear. Loyal Doggett is asking Alex Azar, like, what are you guys doing?
In that regard, beginning with the question of face mask, I'm sure you saw the story that the N95 mask that is important to those who are healthcare providers, that many hospitals only had a week's supply. What is the administration doing to assure that there's an adequate supply of those masks?
We're asking you to fund us buying masks.
I see. So we don't have them now, and 60% of large chain pharmacies also say that they've run out of masks for the public.
The bottom line is, it's like, the best time to get a lawyer is when you don't need one.
Yeah.
Yeah. The best time to buy masks is before you're hit by the wave of panic of people buying masks.
Wait, so that Lyle Doggett, he's a Democrat?
Yes.
Yeah. I feel like, I don't know, my stereotype of Texas is that everyone there is named Lyle Doggett. Yeah, absolutely everyone.
Someone named Dan Crenshaw. So,
yeah.
But it's really more or less the same.
Yeah.
But but your point is a good one, but that's a larger point about preventative care.
Yeah.
That's a larger point about infrastructure. It's like what we're seeing with the coronavirus is that we don't have a lot of preventative care. People have been conditioned to avoid thinking of their medical state as a proactive thing, because for a lot of people it's a crisis. It's always a crisis because it involves so much bureaucracy and so much, well, not everybody, obviously. People some people have health insurance, but like in the absence of that as being just like a blanket thing, it creates a crisis management mentality in a lot of people that prevents them from getting.
But that's on an individual level. But on a governmental level, we're seeing an analogy here to what we saw with FEMA, frankly, which is, during the Clinton administration, one of the things that they did very well was build up FEMA. Bush administration came in, privatized, slashed it. Because you don't need FEMA if there's not a crisis, and most of the time, there's not a crisis. But when one hits, then you're caught essentially with your pants down, and that's what's happened with the CDC. They have been underfunded because we have a government that, to the extent that Donald Trump knows what's going on, it's also being outsourced to Mike Pence, who just basically believes the Lord will take care of all of us, and we don't need to expend money on that stuff. And so when time comes where, like, we need to be prepared for a crisis that we couldn't anticipate, we can't do that, and we're behind the 8 ball now trying to get masks for our first responders. And I should just say, like, for average people going around, the mask is actually for the people who have it. It's not going to necessarily prevent it, but my understanding is nitrile gloves, not a bad idea, particularly if you get on the subway a lot.
I think. Oh, go ahead, please.
Oh yeah.
Did that freak you out, Kate?
Yeah, no, I was just thinking. So you wear like plastic gloves when you're not plastic, but you wear gloves when you're on the subway.
Yeah, you don't want to get. I mean, you're going to look weird, but.
Not to change the subject, but I did comedy in China a couple years ago. And I do believe, based on that experience, that it might be there might be a lot more cases than reported, because a lot of people are. Did
they consistently undercount how many people were watching your comedy?
Yes. No. It was someone was explaining to me, and I'm definitely not like an expert on China or anything, but there are a lot of people in China for some reason that don't qualify for any actually benefits that their government has. I think somebody told me there that it was like half the population. I'm not sure if that's accurate, but I think people who are like living in a different place than the one that they are supposed to live. But basically there's like half or potentially half, a lot of the population that somehow like is not accounted for there because they're living secretly in some way. This is what people explained to me when I was there. I could be wrong. I'm not a China expert. I just told dick jokes there.
There you go. Well,
Yeah.
So Katie has come out as a Chi-Com agent.
Yeah.
An agent
I'm a crisis actor.
Chi comedy
Yeah.
agent.
Tish. No, but I think your point is a good one, and it's about the crisis management aspect of our government, and it speaks to like a philosophical, at least a semi-philosophical question about like what our government is for, and like what it should be doing and what its role. And from my perspective, it's like, you know, it's supposed to be building these infrastructure. It's supposed to be building these things that exist to, in the not the fringe case of a pandemic, because a pandemic is not a fringe case. It's like there's been a lot in the history of mankind, and even if it is a fringe case, as Katie mentioned earlier, it's like the amount of devastation it could cause would make preparing for such a fringe case worthwhile, even if it is even a fringe case. So, but what it comes down to is that we've seen the very idea of governmental infrastructure be attacked by the Trump administration, by the Republicans, and sometimes by the Democrats. They did the government shouldn't be doing anything. There's nothing that the government does better, or the government should only be doing that private industry should not have their hand in. But again, things like pandemics, things like quarantines, disease control, it's like private trying. Like, this is what the government should be doing. This is a very visible example of how eroded our infrastructure has become around the board. You know, people, I've used this analogy all the time. Like, if you're driving on the roads, if you go outside and you're in the Midwest and your roads are unpaved and broken and like they're not being properly funded, there's a good chance, you know, your water is also probably not so great. That the other aspects of your infrastructure are not so great, that are less visible. And so we have to start like not only rebuilding that infrastructure, but rebuilding the ideological underpinnings that support the infrastructure, which is okay, the government needs to be doing something. Right. The government has to be putting money into these things and not just sort of, you know, I know the CDC is the second biggest, deep state front behind NASA, but you know, the minority of money they use to actually combat diseases for optics is still important. You know, we can't just throw out the baby with the bathwater. We have to take the good with the bad there.
Well, okay, yes, I was thinking when you were saying that, like, is there a chance that people don't care at all? I was thinking about the epidemic of mass shooting in this country and how much the people, like these same people, like deny it and like in some cases make up conspiracies about it and say it's not happening and say it's not a problem and say that nothing can be done. Could we see a world where this does become a pandemic and like Republicans and Trump fans continue to deny it? I
think I always take as a baseline that 30% of the people don't care about anything that Donald Trump tells them not to care about.
Yeah.
But if it's in front of their face.
Yeah. So
I feel like that's the safest position to take, is just assume that 30% of them are just like, you're telling me it's day outside, but Donald Trump told me it's night, and I don't care what time it is, it's night.
Yeah.
And I think, I think that number is a fairly fixed number. And then I think it's just various gradations of people outside of that sort of core as you get further away that will, depending on how much it impacts them, whether it's like, oh, wait a second, part of it has to do with like, it's going to hit wealthier people first, actually, because they have the most mobility in society. They do the most amount of plane travel. They're the ones who are going to conventions that are in different places. They're the one largely going to like, to restaurants and and living in more concentrated areas. But the anxiety could reach outside of that. And then of course also, all it takes is if the post office you can't go to or whatever it is, like if you're in a more rural area or something like that, it can get more isolating on some level. So
yeah, it's a lot harder to make a conspiracy theory about something that's happening in front of people's faces and say it's not happening.
Yeah.
Right?
I mean, I think there's going to be, it's quite possible there's going to be sufficient firsthand experience that is going to make it much harder sell than.
Yeah, that's true. People didn't have any conspiracies about the There was another one a couple years ago. What is it? Bird flu, swine flu.
Swine flu.
Yeah.
Yeah, but that was also a slightly
Yeah,
different.
that was a very different time, but
different time.
So I mean, so when it comes to conspiracy theories about stuff like pandemic stuff, they tend to take on a slightly different timbre. It becomes less outright denialism, which you hear with like mass shootings with like false flags, and more about sort of subverting, like this is not just an example of essentially capital and, you know, making society less capable of dealing with a pandemic, but this is a malicious actor. This is like, so it's not like, it's not fake. It's the Freemasons. It's it's a thing that was constructed in a lab by the Chinese, and because obviously, but like everyone mentioned, it's harder to convince people of that something didn't happen if it's happening to them, or like, you know, a lot of people do exist in that framework where like, yeah, you know, the earth is flat because I can't see the curve when I stand outside. It's like, but right. If someone in my family gets the flu, or if I'm constantly seeing on the news, or if I'm afraid, or someone coughs, it's always in my mind. That's a different thing. So I mean, where I think the distinction between mass shootings is that, like, yeah, they happen in discrete communities, and the media kind of moves past it. But those communities don't forget about gun violence. It's like the communities that, you know, the people, and we're seeing a slow radicalization of people against gun violence, against the Second Amendment, against ownership of guns, just because they happen so often and so many people are being personally affected.
I'll tell you something. If you were to take the year's amount of mass shootings and have it all happen in a 2-week period, then I think you might like get to the sort of dynamic that could be taking place here. And I will say this, the Republicans and the conservatives are far better at weaponizing this. They did it with the caravan, although, you know, granted, the caravan was, you know, sort of fed into their narrative about immigration. But nevertheless, they created that in the run up to the election. Ebola. I mean, you know, I don't know how much you guys remember this. I distinctly remember being on Al Sharpton's show and being asked the question of, like, you know, he was like, it was a very weird situation. There were 3 of us standing. I didn't know we go in standing. I usually don't wear pants that you really want to show on television, particularly at that time. And Crystal Ball was one of the people there, and she was on like regularly. I was just a contributor. And Al Sharpton was in a remote studio. And he says, you know, like we're supposed to just talk about like 3 different topics or something, like one of those fast things. And the first one was like, Sam, how come the Republicans spend so much time on Ebola? And I'm like, well, and he goes, oh, hold on. And they cut. Literally, like I'm looking at a camera, I'm looking at a TV where Al Sharpton was, and they cut from him to the live feed of a helicopter showing the ambulance that's taking the one nurse who was sequestered, you know, outside in New Jersey to the airport to fly her to like Maine or something. And he repeats the question as I am looking at the ambulance from like the O.J. Simpson thing. And I'm like, well, because you're asking me that question as we're showing the image of the, like we're feeding into it.
Yeah.
And they made a lot of hay out of Ebola. Donald Trump did. I'm sure there's tweets back there about Ebola that he's done.
Well, I mean, where I think there's a lot of overlap between Ebola and mass shootings and the coronavirus is when, like, the people, like you mentioned before, the people who are afraid are quite a valuable population. Like, just like mass shootings, the specific type of mass shootings that make people afraid are the school shootings, the random shootings that occur in, you know, in areas where non-gang members are present. So like it's the fear of like the suburban housewife.
Right. It's the randomness.
It's the randomness of it. Like, well, like I'm supposed to be protected by society.
Exactly.
And so if I'm not being protected, there must be a breakdown.
I've structured
here.
my life in a way to that I've calculated what the risks are, and I have structured my life in such a way that I avoid those. And then when you bring in an element that could just like hit me despite that, I can't even take steps theoretically to protect myself from it. All right.